Our second speaker is Karen Brodeur. Karen is the Program Manager, Sector Development for the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada in Nova Scotia. Karen has worked for many years in the management of co-ops and has also lived in a housing co-op in British Columbia. Karen is pursuing a Master's of Management in Co-ops and Credit Unions at St. Mary's University.
Perfect. Thank you and welcome everyone. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Karen Brodeur and I am the Program Manager for the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. Put it down a little bit more. Hopefully my presentation will be as interesting as the last presentation, but I'm not so sure. I am going to give you a brief overview of CHF Canada, just so you know where I'm coming from. And then I've been asked to speak today about the nonprofit housing, rental housing cooperatives that were built in Nova Scotia and across Canada and the different government programs that they were built under. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'd also like to talk about some challenges that the Nova Scotia housing cooperatives have been facing and the way that maybe we can turn those into new opportunities for the future. So CHF Canada is the national voice for nonprofit housing cooperatives in Canada, and we have just over 1,000 members. Some are housing cooperatives and others are associates that work directly with housing cooperatives. We have offices in Vancouver, Winnipeg, Ottawa, and in Dartmouth. So that's a little bit. Let's see if this works for me. It's not going to work. There we go. So we have 67 members in Nova Scotia that are members of our organization, and our members are housing cooperatives. Housing cooperatives pay a national dues, and in Nova Scotia they actually pay a second dues that helps offset the cost of having a local office. We have 2 staff members in our local office, myself, and I work with projects in difficulty and provide the education services that housing co-ops need. And we also have a member services officer, and she works member recruitment and making sure that the members are getting the services that they need. We were opened in May of 2002, so prior to that, there was a national organization that ended up not surviving, so we sort of took over from them. So that's just a little bit about what we do. So this just gives you an overview of housing cooperatives in Nova Scotia. So as you can see, there are 48 housing cooperatives in the HRM under the programs that I'm going to talk about, 11 in the Amherst-Antigonish area, 10 in the South Shore Valley area, and 6 here in Cape Breton. And of the 6 in Cape Breton, there are 3 in Sydney, 1 in Port Hawkesbury, 1 in Cheticamp, and 1 in Sydney Mines. So that's sort of the makeup of the program, the co-ops under the programs I'm going to talk about today. So we do have 76 co-ops in the program. And the average size for housing cooperatives in Nova Scotia is 25 units, and that's compared to 41 units in Canada. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about scale and the size of housing cooperatives and the impact that has had in Nova Scotia. We also make up about 2%, Nova Scotia makes up about 2% of all the nonprofit housing cooperatives in Canada. I'm used to looking at a screen, so I have to keep looking to make sure I'm where I need to be. So in Canada and in Nova Scotia, housing cooperatives were developed under 3 programs from 1974 to 1992. The Section 3418 program, the Section 95, previously 56.1 program, and the ILM, or the Index-Linked Mortgage Program. All 3 of these programs were government-funded programs administered at the time of development by CMHC. So in 2002, just to sort of move my slides around a little bit, but in 2002, the administration of these programs was actually devolved to the province. So CMHC was no longer going to be administering the program. They gave it to the Department of Community Services, Housing Services, and now it's that group that actually administers these agreements with housing cooperatives in Nova Scotia. So I just want to talk a little bit about the end of the operating agreement, and at the end I'm going to show you a video on this. The majority of the Section 95, the majority of co-ops in Canada and in Nova Scotia, these operating agreements with government are going to end by the year 2020, and this is going to have an impact on the operations of some of these co-ops. Some positive impacts, but also some negative impacts that I can see for the future. So I think it's really important for us to see. If you look at the red, that's the majority of the Section 95 co-ops, so they were the federally funded co-ops. The provincially funded co-ops that were developed a little bit later, their operating agreements will end a little later. So what does this mean? Well, the positive is it means that these co-ops will no longer have a mortgage payment. Their first mortgage with CMHC will be gone. But they're also going to have a lot of deferred maintenance, a lot of capital costs, and there's a really good chance that they're going to have to take out new mortgages. It also means that they're not going to have that safety net of government. Cooperatives in Canada and in Nova Scotia have really used the government to go to when they get into trouble. And the government, specifically in Nova Scotia, has been very good at trying to help bail some of them out. They're not going to have that anymore. As well, housing cooperatives developed under these programs, or under 2 of the 3 programs, have had subsidies to help house low-income families, and those subsidies at the end of these operating agreements will be gone. So it's going to be really important for housing cooperatives to learn to plan, to determine whether or not they want to be able to provide subsidies to low-income families and how they're going to do that. And that's something that co-ops need to be looking at now. So those are going to be some of the challenges. It's also important to note that housing co-ops will still be governed under the Cooperative Associations Act. So there still will be legislation that will protect some of the nonprofit status of housing co-ops in our country and in Nova Scotia. But I still believe that housing co-ops are going to be a little lost without that framework that the government has provided all these over the last 25, 30, 35 years. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about the programs, but it's going to be a quick overview because I only have 20 minutes. So at the end, if you have questions, please feel free to ask me. And hopefully some of the language won't be Greek because sometimes we get used to talking about certain things and we forget that it's not known by all. But I'm going to talk about the 3 programs. The first program was the Section 3418 program that began in 1974. And CHF Canada began lobbying the government for a program to help build new housing cooperatives. And so, spearheaded by Alex Laidlaw, who was a student of the Antigonish movement here in Nova Scotia, the National Housing Act was actually changed, and the first cooperative housing legislation was formed for a new program. And this new program was a program that allowed for startup funding by CMHC to the housing cooperative, a reduced mortgage rate over a 50-year period at 8%. And at that point, interest rates were between 10 and 12 and actually rising. So 8% seemed like a reasonable interest rate. Mortgages were given at 90% of the cost, which meant grants were given for 10% of the capital cost. So housing cooperatives were built, and a total of, by the end of the program, a total of 10,000 units across Canada. 240 housing cooperatives were built under this program, so quite a few. 5 cooperatives were built in Nova Scotia, but none of those are in Cape Breton. So some of the problems that were seen with this program towards the end of it was that 65 to 75% of the housing constructed went to middle-income families. So there was no money available for those low-income families. And government at the time just felt that it wasn't meeting their social mandate, that they wanted to provide housing to low income. They had all kinds of grants for new homeowners. They had grants for middle to upper middle class families so that they could buy homes. And then they had this program that was going to middle class. But it wasn't serving the needs of their social housing mandate. So because of that, the program was cut and stopped. So a year later, after more lobbying by cooperative members across the country and CHF Canada as well, a new program was developed called the Section 95. It began as the 56-1, but became the Section 95 program. And even though CMHC was no longer willing to do direct mortgages to housing cooperatives, they were willing to be a mortgage insurer for private lenders for 35-year mortgages. So this new program included what we call supply or bridge